Well, it's full on summer, the garden is producing like crazy, and it is time to can up some tomatoes. I thought I'd take you guys along with me. Hey there, welcome back to another Slightly Rednecked video. Again, my name's Chris, and if you're not familiar with this channel, I help you to produce your own meat, eggs, and vegetables from your backyard, your balcony, your deck, your garage, or even a spare room in your house if that's the way you want to do it. Today we're going to be canning tomatoes like I said, so I've got a sink full of tomatoes here that just came out of the garden the last day or two. About half of them a day or so ago and the other half of them today. And it's quite a bit, so I need to get them canned up, get them preserved. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and washed all my jars. I'm going to be canning these in quart jars. So if you're not familiar with canning, make sure you use a good canning jar. I like ball jars. As you can tell by my canning shirt maybe. I do like ball jars the best, but Kerr works fine, or Kerr, I don't know how you pronounce that, Kerr, whatever. As long as it's a good canning jar, make sure you use a good canning lid. Again, I've got some ball lids right here, but that's just because I had to buy new jars and the ball lids came on it. There are other brands out there that work just fine. You can use those. And you're going to need the rings to tighten the lids down on. So now, these are not reusable. These are one-time use. Once you've used them, you're going to be taking them off the jars, throwing them away. But everything else here, the rings, the jars, all that you can use over and over again. So in the future, you don't have to buy whole jars just to get the lids. You can just buy the lids themselves, and that's all you'll need. So it's a pretty cost-effective way to preserve food once you get the initial, cost of it down. So I've got to get these ready to go into the canner themselves. But first things first, again, wash everything. Wash it really well. This recipe, you don't technically have to sterilize your jars for this recipe because it is it's a long processing time. We're going to be water bath canning these. Tomatoes are just on the verge of being acidic enough to water bath can, so we are going to have to add some acid. I'm going to be doing that with lemon juice. 2 tablespoons per quart is what it's going to call for. But then we'll be fine to go ahead and water bath can these. And of course my dog decides right now is a good time to eat his dinner, so if you hear him crunching in the background, I apologize, it won't take him long, he's about done. Alright, so what I'm going to do, I've got my canner about halfway, a little over halfway full. I've got enough tomatoes, I think, for 6 jars, so I went ahead and washed 7. I'm going to prepare 7 just to make sure I have enough. It's not a big deal if I don't use the 7th one. It can just sit in the canner empty while it processes, no big deal. But what I am going to do is fill these all up with about, I don't know, halfway, 3/4 away full of water, put them in the canner and drop them down under the water so I can make sure that I've got enough water in my canner. It takes a long time for the canner to heat up, so just start it right when you start all this process. I've already got it heating up on the stove. It's going to take a while. It's going to take a half hour or more. By the time it gets heated up, I'm probably be done with getting the tomatoes prepped. I'm going to show you how to do that. Let me get these filled up and then we'll put them in the canner and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is my canner. It will hold up to 7 jars, 7 quart jars at one time. So I'm going to go ahead and put 7 in there. I may not use all 7. I may only use 5 or 6, but just in case, I'm going to make sure I have them all ready to go. This is just a standard canner. You can buy it at any big box store, Walmart, any of those places like that. You don't have to have a canner like this. You can use a big stock pot. You may not be able to put as many jars in it as one time. You won't have necessarily this nice rack to lift your jars in and out with. But you can use like an old cloth, cotton dish towel or something like that, put it in the bottom. You don't want the jars sitting directly on the bottom of the pan. You do want them raised up just a little bit so they're not in direct contact with the pan. But that's about it. So I've got it full of, about half full of water. I'm not sure if I've got enough water in there or not yet. I'm going to get my jars in there, lower them down. We'll see how much water we got. And I'm not filling the jars all the way to the top with water because if I don't need to add more water, I don't want to have to take water out of this if it's too much. I'd rather not have to do that. But I do want a little bit of water in them, just more than anything, so they'll sink. They won't float to the top whenever I lower them down. So we're going to lower them down into the water slowly. And they're still floating a little bit. But I think we're good. I think we're good on that. So what you want, that water's starting to get hot already. What you want is 1 inch over the top of these jars. So I've got just a little over 1 inch on the top of these jars, and that's going to be just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and close this canner up and let it come up to temperature. Like I said, it's going to take a while. We need to get it up to a rolling boil whenever we start to process these tomatoes, and it's going to take a long time to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'm going to go prep the tomatoes while I'm waiting on that. Alright, so to prep the tomatoes, I highly suggest one of these things called a tomato shark or a strawberry core or something like that. Anyway, you can use it whatever. We're going to take the core out of them. So I just, turn it around the stem, take the core out. Sometimes on these bigger tomatoes, here, let me do this one real quick and then I'll show you what I'm talking about on the bigger ones. And then we're going to cut just a crisscross, just a slight crisscross in the skin on the bottom. We're going to get these peeled before we can them up. All right, let me get a bigger one this time and I'll show you kind of what I'm talking about. And if you have some tomatoes with some bad parts on them, like this one's got a little hole in it right there, so I'm going to check that and make sure there's not a bug inside of it, but as long as there's not, I'm just going to cut that out. So let me get, sometimes on these bigger ones you got to take it in chunks, just kind of work your way around the stem with that. Ah, there we go. And it's not too bad, but you can see maybe just a little bit of stem stuff there, kind of greenish colored, so I'll just kind of scoop that out a little bit. There we go. Good. That one's ready to go. And I got quite a few of them to do here. Let me find one. See, there, this one's got a pretty good bad spot on it. So we'll see whenever I get it going, if I can cut all that away and still have some tomato left. It's not that big a deal. It doesn't ruin your whole tomato. The rest of the tomato is fine. There's no reason to just throw it out. All right, let me get these done, and then we'll be back with you and we'll show you the next step. So, again, it's pretty easy. This one's got a crack down the side. I could cut that out with a knife, or I can just take care of it right now. I didn't quite get all of it. There we go. All right, let me get these all done, and then we'll be right back with you. All right, so we're about ready for the next step here. What I've got here is a pot of water that's it's coming to a boil. It's just about to boil, so it's close enough. And I need to get these tomatoes peeled, so I'm going to be blanching them. So I'm going to add 3 or 4, maybe 5 to this pot, however many I can handle. Let them sit in there for, I don't know, 20 seconds or so, something like that. It's not, it's not exact. Just, you don't want to cook them necessarily, but you do want to get them, the skin to loosen up, and it'll do that. So what I typically do is just, I don't know, give them, I just kind of eyeball it and guess at it. There's not really a for sure way. One thing you'll notice is if you take them out and you try to peel them afterwards and they're tough to peel, well, you didn't leave them in there long enough, leave the next ones in there a little bit longer. If they're super easy to peel, then you got it just about right. If they're just kind of mushy and all, you left them in there too long. So how's that looking? You can kind of see the skin starting to split and crinkle a little bit. That means they're probably done. So I'm going to move them over to an ice bath. So this is just, this is just nothing but ice right now, but it'll be ice water here in a minute because the tomatoes will start melting the ice. So they quit cooking and I can handle them and get them to peel. And pull that water out so I don't have so much water in there. And then I'm trying to do this without blocking the camera. It's kind of tricky. Get them cooled off a little bit. And then you should be able to, whoops, dropping some ice. I always drop ice whenever I do this. So let me get my bowls out of the way here. So then to peel them, the peel should just come right off. I didn't quite leave that one in there long enough. It's a little bit harder than it should be to peel. This peel should slip right off, but it's still not that bad. This is a messy job. You're going to get your hands kind of messy. I always have to wash them off in between, but that's okay. It's not that big a deal. Now you can save the skins if you want to. You can dehydrate them, make like tomato powder out of them basically. I don't bother with doing that. They're just going to go in the compost pile. That's a little tough spot right there. I think I'm going to have to cut that off. See that little black spot right there? So no big deal. We'll just take the knife and slice it off there. Rest of it looks good. Now I'm going to cut this in half, and I know you probably can't see that bowl off to the side. I've got a bowl over there. Because it's a bigger tomato, I always cut them in half. You don't have to do that. You could can them whole. Now this one's a lot better. This one's peeling a lot easier, and the peel should just almost slip off. So that one was in there just a little bit longer probably. I can't grab a hold of the skin. Oh, there's a little piece I left on. And that looks pretty good. Where's my knife? And then I'll cut this one in half too. These are a combination like a dual purpose slicer or peeling tomato or a canning tomato. So they are, a breed that, specifically grown for canning as well as for slicing. I usually like to can paste tomatoes, like aroma, or I use an Amish paste, which is very similar to aroma. So that's my preferred tomato to can, and I don't usually cut those in half because they're smaller, more pear-shaped. But these are just a little bit different, and these are super juicy, so we'll go through that here in just a few minutes though. Alright, so I've got a lot of tomatoes to peel. I'm just going to work in batches until I get them all peeled, cut up, and put in the bowl. The littlest ones I won't bother cutting up. This one's got a lot of spots on the top. The ones that don't come away with the peel, I'll just cut away with the knife. But let me get this one done. Sometimes you can just grab a hold of that and just pull them off. These are all just coming right off, so no big deal. Oh, my water is really boiling now. I need to turn it down a little bit. All right. Like I said, let me get the rest of these all peeled and prepared, and then we'll come back and show you the next step. All right, so I got all my tomatoes all cut up, put over here in a bowl on the side. I went ahead and cleaned my pot out here, filled it up with a little bit more water. I didn't fill it all the way up. I'm not going to need that much, so I just filled it about halfway. Got that heated up. It's almost boiling. I'm going to need some hot water, some pretty close to boiling water. But I think I'm ready to get started on this, because by the time I get the jars all filled ready, this is going to be boiling, ready to go. So I'm going to take the lid off my canner. I had to turn it down because it started to boil, and I didn't want it to boil over or boil dry. It's still boiling, so we're going to turn it down just a little more. And let me get a couple of towels here so I can get the jars out of the water. This is a little tricky to do from the side. Sorry, I know I'm blocking it, but anyway, lifted them up, got the jars out of the water. Let me get my jar lifter. This is a must. So what I'm going to do is take this jar over to the sink, dump it out. I'm going to turn that heat back up, keep that canner hot. Dump this sink out. Not that much, there we go. I don't need that water in the canner because it is, it's already full without it. So anyway, this helps to, I've got to add my other stuff to it. So I'm going to be adding 2 tablespoons of lemon juice to this jar. And if you go a little over 2, it's not that big of a deal. Just at least 2. We need to raise the, or lower the pH, raise the acidity in it just a little bit. And then I'm going to add a teaspoon of salt. Make sure you're using canning and pickling salt, not just like regular table salt. And the salt is optional. You don't have to add the salt in, but I like it. I like a little bit of salt. Brings the flavor of the tomatoes out. Now, it's just a matter of putting tomatoes in. Now I use a funnel, it makes it a little bit easier. This is one of the reasons I cut the tomatoes in half. I find that they go into the jar a little bit easier when they're this big. And then it's easier just to get them down in there. Plus you're not touching the hot jar, the edge of the hot jar with your fingers. And I'm going to push them down a little bit. Now these are super juicy tomatoes. Usually when you're canning paste tomatoes, they're not this juicy, but these have a lot of juice in them. And just kind of push them down, and I'm going to pack just about as many as I can in there. That's probably getting pretty close to the top, so that's pretty close. I may be able to get 1 or 2 more in there, but I don't want to go overboard with this one until I get my jars out and get going, so I know how many I've got. I don't want to overpack one jar and then have one jar that's half empty. So let me get another jar. And it's the same process. Now I'm going to leave this jar back here, and I'm not going to put the lid on it or anything like that until I get them all done. I don't want to grab that, it's hot. Because I don't want to, if you put the lids on them, sometimes when they're hot like this and you let them set for very long, the lid can seal. And if the lid seals, then it's no good. You're going to have to throw the lid away and get a new lid. So I don't put the lids on them until I'm all done and ready to go in the canner. All right, teaspoon of salt. And then let's start packing tomatoes. I may have mentioned this at the front of the video, but lots of people ask me about canning salsa or tomato sauce. I don't do any of that. If I want to make salsa, I just open a jar of tomatoes and make salsa out of it. If I want to make spaghetti sauce, I open a jar and make spaghetti sauce. I don't can that stuff ahead of time. I just don't find a need to do it. But that's just me. I mean, you can do whatever you want to do. How are we doing here? Push them down. I think I can get one more in there, a smaller one. That's a bigger one, but we'll do that. And you can see just how juicy those tomatoes are. I mean, it almost fills up the whole jar just with the juice from the tomatoes. All right, let me get the rest of these done, and then we'll come back and show you the next step. Okay, I got these all packed about as full as I can get them. I could pack more in, but I'm out of tomatoes. So now, I'm going to be adding a little bit of hot water. Hopefully I'm not blocking the camera too much. So I just want to top them off with some hot water. I want to get them to about an inch from the top, which is about that set of rings right there on the jar. So that's about an inch. And you can see it's not going to take much water to top these off because those tomatoes have a ton of juice in them. Now there's one more step that I got to do here. Let me just show you with one jar before I get going on too many of them here. Get my hands, get my arms out of the way. Where's my knife? So this will hold a bunch of air bubbles, and I don't know if you can see them, but there's air bubbles down in there. You want to get all these air bubbles out of here. So just stick a knife, a chopstick, whatever, down in there, around the sides, down in the middle, kind of wiggle it around a little bit, make sure we get all those air bubbles out. We don't want those in there. We want to make sure, and it will hold a surprising amount of air. Look how much that liquid dropped. I don't know if you can tell that on camera, but that's a lot. So now I'm going to need to top that off just a little bit more. There we go. Now that jar is ready to go. Let me get the rest of them. Whoops, that's a hot burner. Get the rest of them all taken care of. And then we'll get the lids on them and get them in the canner. Now's a good time to turn my canner back up, get it heated back up so it'll start boiling again. It's pretty hot. I kept it pretty hot, but I didn't. But it did cool off enough to where it stopped boiling. With the lid off of it, it doesn't take a whole lot. Okay, do that. Let's get our air bubbles out. Not as many air bubbles in this one. I think it's good. All right, it's good to go. So let me get the rest of these done, and then we'll come back and we'll start putting lids on them. Okay, got all the jars filled, ready to put the lids on. The next thing we want to do is get a nice damp paper towel or something like that. Wipe the lid off the rim of the jar. You want to make sure nothing's on there that's going to prevent that lid from sealing down. So, and I like to flip my paper towel around because I'll pick up gunk on one and then I don't want to transfer it to the next jar. So it gets a clean little section of it every time. And just wipe it off real good. I got a second paper towel, we'll use it on the others. Okay. And we're ready to put lids on. We're just about done here. So, oh, I'm gonna have to wash that one. The lid process is pretty easy. Set the lid on top, make sure I've only got one. I don't, I have two. There we go. These have all been washed. And then we're gonna put the ring on, make sure it goes on straight. And to tighten it, you just want it pretty much finger tight. Don't crank it down too tight. Just let me get it straightened up so it goes on. There we go. Basically what I do is I spin it until it kind of stops on its own and then give it just a half or quarter twist, something like that. So again, you don't want to crank it down too tight. You crank it down too tight, you've got a good chance of your lids bubbling and bowing in the process. So let me get the rings on these and the lids on them, and then we'll get them in the canner. I know you can't see my face or anything, but that's okay. That's not the important part. All right, so as far as putting them in the canner, I've got my canner just kind of at a simmer, It's not completely boiling, but it's at a simmer. So I'm going to set these jars in here, opposite sides of each other so they don't tip the rack over. I gotta get the one in the middle. There we go. And come on, get down in there. Something's going on. It's not wanting to sit in the middle. There, it's down. Good. Now comes the time to drop the canner down, drop these down. Be careful. This is why you don't want your water too full. You don't want to get your fingers in that boiling water. You want to make sure that it sits down in there. And I am just a little bit shy on water. Here's the good thing is I got a pot of boiling water right here beside it. So we'll just add a little bit more water. Again, you want an inch of water over the top of these jars. So I'm going to add some. And since it's already boiling water, or at least really hot water, we're not going to have to worry too much about having to wait for that to heat back up. So, now the water temperature's dropped. It's not boiling right now. You probably can't see inside the pot. So we're going to have to put the lid on it, kick that up as high as I can, and wait for it to come to a boil before we can do anything else. So, let me get situated here. We'll come back and talk to you while I'm waiting on it to come to a boil. Okay, one thing I want to stress here is the importance of making sure you follow food safety, and that when you're preserving food like this, I mean, this is a great way to preserve your tomatoes. You can freeze them. I prefer to can them because you open that can up in the middle of winter and it's just like summertime all over again. They just come out of there tasting almost exactly like what they came off the vine. And they're so good in stews and chilies and making your own marinara or salsa or any of those kinds of things. But you got to be safe about the way you do it. And the first step to that is cleanliness. Make sure you clean everything. Wash everything you're going to be using. Don't just run it through the dishwasher. Wash it good. You can run it through the dishwasher if you want to as well. And then the second part of that is follow a tested recipe. And this is my preferred book. This is the Blue Ball Book of Home Preserving or Guide to Preserving. This will tell you everything you need to know. So if you're a question, and always check your recipe. Always check your recipe. I've done this, I don't know. This is probably my 7th batch of tomatoes we've canned this year, so I'm pretty familiar with it. But still, always double check your recipe and make sure you're doing the right things. I got to look it up here. I got to figure out where it is. Tomatoes. It is on, I think it's 32 or 116. One of those two. Let me find it. Okay, there's tomatoes. So there's a couple options for tomatoes here. You've got tomatoes packed in water or tomatoes packed in their own juice. One of the two. Now, tomatoes packed in water are going to be more like when you do paste tomatoes. So you've got tomatoes in there, they're not super juicy, and you're going to add a lot more water to the jars, like half a jar full of water. You'll notice when I filled these jars with water, it was just a little bit of water. There wasn't much at all. So I'm considering these packed in their own juice. And for that, I need to, everything I did was correct. I put the right amount of lemon juice, I put the right amount of salt. If you want salt, again, you don't have to put salt in there if you want to. Pack them in, fill them, lower them into simmering water. The water must cover the jars by 1 inch. Adjust the heat to medium-high. Cover the canner and bring the water to a rolling boil. Process the pint or quart jars 1 hour and 25 minutes. So once this comes to a boil, we're going to start the timer for 1 hour and 25 minutes, 85 minutes, I think, if my math is right. Turn off the heat, remove the cover, let jars cool 5 minutes, remove the jars from the canner and do not retighten the bands if loose. Cool 12 hours, test the seals, label, and store jars. That's it. The process for tomatoes packed in water is pretty much the same thing, except for it says to process the pint jars for 40 minutes or quart jars for 45 minutes. So you can see there's a big difference in processing time. And since these are packed in their own juice primarily, they're such juicy tomatoes, I'm going to follow the packed in their own juice section, and I'm going to be processing these for 85 minutes. It's a pretty long time to run your canner, but once you get it going, it's really not that bad. All I got to do is wait for this thing to start boiling. It sounds like it might be. Let me check it real quick. Oh, we're just almost boiling. I got a few bubbles coming up, but I need a good boil, a good solid boil, not just a bubble here and a bubble there. One thing I will tell you, once this starts boiling and you start your timer, it needs to remain boiling the entire time. So if it stops boiling at any point, like my oven sometimes has a temperature, or my stovetop I should say, has a tendency to, if it overboils and water splashes onto it, it'll shut off. And if that happens, the water stops boiling, I got to start all over again. So I got to bring it back up to a boil and start my timer from scratch, start it from there on. And it may seem picky, it may seem like you really don't need to do all that. My grandma never used to do that. I got friends that have canned this different way for years or whatever. And that may be true. You may never have an issue with it ever. But all it takes is one time. Botulism is a serious, serious thing. You can't smell it, you can't taste it, you can't see it. And if it starts to develop in your jars and you eat that, there's a good chance you're going to die from it. Or you're going to have other people die. There was a famous story about a woman that canned potatoes, I believe it was. Either potatoes or, canned potatoes. She made potato salad with them. She didn't follow a proven recipe. She just followed a recipe that she had always used, that her mother had always used, they'd never had problems with, but it wasn't a tested, proven, out of a book like a blue ball book recipe. She took that potato salad to a church lunch, like a potluck kind of thing, and I don't know how, 15, 16 people died from botulism. It's a pretty serious thing. You don't want to play around with that. So follow a safe recipe, do it the right way. Other than, as long as you processed everything correctly and the jars seal and all those kinds of things, this food's going to last for a very long time. They typically say 18 months. 2, 3, 4, 5 years, they're usually fine. You're going to know, if anything else goes wrong with it, you're going to know. It's going to be moldy, it's going to be, turn colors, whatever. You're going to know. But, as far as as long as you follow the process and you do it the way the book says to do it, you process it for the right amount of time and the jars seal, you're going to be fine. All right. I will say that's why it's important to add citric acid of some kind, either lemon juice or regular citric acid, when you're water bath canning tomatoes, because they are just on the verge of being acidic enough. So if you don't know, you can water bath high acid foods. So that would be pickles, because you're using a bunch of vinegar in there. Again, use a trusted recipe. Make sure you're using enough vinegar to get the pH low enough that they'll be safe. Pickles, anything pickled with vinegar, for the most part, with a trusted recipe, can be water bath canned. Jellies, jams, all that stuff can be water bath canned. When you start getting into low acid foods like green beans, corn, any kind of meat, any of that kind of stuff, if you want to can that stuff, it's got to be pressure canned. And that's a different process altogether, which I don't know if I've done videos on that before. I have done videos on water bath canning, but I don't know that I've done videos on pressure canning. Let me check my canner again, see if it's boiling yet. Oh, just almost. Watch pot never boils, right? So I'm going to walk away from it for 5 minutes, come back and check it again, and as long as it's boiling, we're good to go. We'll set the timer and we can just kind of monitor it a little bit to make sure it stays boiling. What I'll have to do is I'll have to adjust my heat down just a little bit, because otherwise it will boil over and splash on the stove. So I need to watch it pretty close till it gets to that point, adjust my heat down just a little bit, and then keep an eye on it and make sure it continues to boil the entire time. I've got it down pretty good now. I've done this many, many times, so I kind of know where that setting is on my stove. And you'll figure it out on yours as well. The first time or two, you may have to kind of babysit it a little bit, but after that, you'll figure out kind of where that is, and it's not as big of an issue. Well, I can hear it just almost boiling. Anyway, I'll come back when it starts boiling. We'll start the timer, and we'll go from there. All right, let's take a look here, see what we got going on. Ooh, I think it is boiling. Oh, yeah, that's a good boil. I need to turn that down just a little bit. Make sure it continues to boil. We'll give it just a minute or two, and then I'm going to set my timer here real quick. 85 minutes. It's a long time, and it's already getting late. It's tough getting this stuff done after work, but sometimes that's the only time you got to do it. So get home from work, go pick things out of the garden, and start canning, right? It'll pay off in the wintertime. Okay, let's double check one more time. Yep, still good boil. So we are good to go. We'll be back in 85 minutes or so when they're done. I'll show you what we do at that point. All right, so it has been 85 minutes. So what we're going to do is turn the stove off here, give it just a second, and I'm going to remove the lid from the canner and just let this thing sit for about 5 or 10 minutes, because you don't want to go pulling these out of here right away. These are hot, they're boiling. You don't want to, if you pull them out too quick, what you're going to end up with is siphoning out the top of the jars, which doesn't necessarily ruin them, but it looks unappetizing. Let me show you a jar here. This is a jar. I kind of made that mistake early on with my first batch of tomatoes. Pulled them out just a little too early, and a bunch of liquid siphoned out. So you can see I've got this huge amount of airspace right there in the jar. Now this doesn't mean that these are bad. It's not unhealthy. I mean, these are still preserved. The lid's on there. It's sealed, so it's fine. What may end up happening is the tomatoes on the top that are exposed to the air may kind of get discolored. But as far as healthy wise, they're okay. It's just not ideal. So we're going to leave them in there for at least 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and I'll show you the next step that we're going to take. All right, so it has been about 6 minutes or so, something like that. So these should be ready to go ahead and pull out of here. Like I said, you want to let them sit for about 5 minutes. So I'm just going to lift the rack up here. And, of course, my glasses fog up. And they look pretty good, really. Not bad at all. So, next thing we're going to do, move them over to an area to cool. And I know you can't see this. I've just got a couple of towels on the counter over here. And I'm just going to be setting them on the towels. It's not uncommon for you to get some of the siphoning out of the jars into the water. In fact, that's pretty common. So you may smell tomatoes when you open this up. That's okay, that's nothing to worry about. And that's pretty much all there is to it. All I'm going to do is let those set. Just don't mess with them. Don't touch them. Just leave them alone for about 12 hours. You may hear the lid start to ping. You'll hear a ping sound. That's the lid sealing down on the jar. That's a good sign. So it's always a good sound to hear. It'll take a little while, 20, 30 minutes, something like that. As they start to cool off, those lids will seal down on there really nice and tight. And that's it. Just leave them alone for about 12 hours. Once they are cooled off completely, like I said, 12 hours. Then you can remove the rings off the top of them. And there's a reason why you want to remove the rings off the top. They are sealed jars, and you may have seen the last jar I brought in. I've already put it back up, so I don't have it with me. Didn't have a ring on it. And there's a reason why you want to take the ring off, because you want to know if that jar becomes unsealed for some reason. That means it's a bad jar at that point. So if the food inside starts to spoil and puts pressure on that, pops that lid off. If you have the ring on there, you'll never know that, because it'll hold the lid down. If you take the ring off and it pops the lid, you'll know. And that's the reason why you don't want to keep the rings on it. Not only that, but you don't need nearly as many rings. You just need 8 or 9 rings, because you can only can about 7 or 8 jars at a time. If you're going to do multiple canning, you get what I'm saying. You don't need nearly as many. You don't have to have a ring for every jar in your cupboard. Just as many as you're going to be able to can at one time, and then you can remove those rings and you can use them on the next batch that you're going to be canning. So anyway, do remove the rings once they've cooled off. Give them about 12 hours, and that's it. These are good for 18 months at least. I would say good, 4 or 5 years probably at the least. But 18 months is generally what's recommended. Anyway, thank you guys for watching this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I imagine many of you guys that watch this channel probably already know all this stuff about canning, but there are a lot of new people out there that don't, so I thought I would share this as I did. Can up those tomatoes from the garden. It's a great way to preserve your tomatoes. It's just like you open that jar up in the wintertime, and it's just like summertime all over again. You got that fresh, almost as fresh as coming out of the garden tomato. It's just, I've been known to open a jar up to make something with, and just you could smell that tomato and just take a bite of one and then just end up sitting there and eating the whole jar of tomatoes. It's just, they're so good. So anyway, thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and as always, God bless.